Welcome. This is the 8th meeting of our connectedlearning.tv webinar series. You can find out about future sessions at connectedlearning.tv and also archives of previous sessions. Today, we are welcoming Erin Knight, who's going to be our special guest. Erin is the Senior Leading Director at Mozilla and currently spearheads learning and badge work, overseeing the building of learning pathways for webmaker skills, as well as the development of the open badge infrastructure.
All right, great. Should I dive in?
Okay, so before you dive in, let's have our respondents briefly introduce themselves, and then Erin will dive in and talk for a few minutes, and then we will have a conversation. So why don't we start with you, Carla? Brief descriptions for the folks.
Hi, everybody. Sorry if there's a little bit of an echo, but my name is Carla Casilli. I actually work with Erin. I work on the Open Badges project, and I'm really happy to be here and to be in support of the Open Badges. So if you have questions, happy to answer them, but I'm sure Erin's going to do an amazing job as usual. So that's it for me.
Thank you. Daniel?
Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Hickey. I'm at Indiana University. And I'll be hanging out, working with the initiative. I'm working on a proposal right now with Connie and Mimi to sort of help bring together some of the research literature and work with collaborate closely with some individual projects. And I've been writing about this at my blog at Remediating Assessment and hanging out with everybody else. And really excited about all the stuff that's happening and looking forward to learning about badges and using them. We're going to do a hack jam here in Bloomington about a month from now. So that'll be our first rollout of Open Badges. Thanks.
Doug?
Hi, my name's Doug Belshaw. I'm at JISC-Infonet. I'm over in England. I'm in Newcastle right now, where it's the end of the working day. I was one of the judges for the DML competition. I'm a bit of a badge evangelist, and I'm trying to do all I can over here to try and get some traction for Open Badges.
It's nice that we have people located in lots of different places here. Michael?
Hi, how's it going, everyone? My name is Michael Lai. I'm a sophomore studying political science at Harvard University, and I'm also working for an early stage ed tech startup called Turn Right. Feel a little bit out of place here among all these really experienced and cutting edge innovators, but hopefully I can learn a little bit and contribute a little bit as well. So really excited to be here.
Thank you, Michael. And Philip?
Hi, I'm Phil Simon. I'm the director of the Interactive Media Master's Program at Quinnipiac University in Hamden, Connecticut. I'm here because some of my faculty are starting to use badges in their courses, and we think it's a valuable learning tool, but we're working very hard in figuring out how it fits into traditional curriculum.
Erin, take it away.
All right. So let me share my screen. I have a number of slides here. I'm notorious for being able to get through slides pretty quickly, but I just want to make sure, because I know we have a wider audience other than our panelists here, I want to make sure that we do just a quick run through of sort of what we're talking about with badges and also what Mozilla is building so that we're sort of starting from the same page, and then we can dive into some of the bigger issues together. So what are badges, right? So when we're talking about badges, we're really talking about representations of skills and achievements. And as you'll see, as I get a little further in the presentation, we're not just talking about images, right? Like, we're talking about a lot more information behind them. But Scouting might be the first example that comes to mind, and certainly there are connections there. I mean, as with the Girls and the Boy Scouts, we know that kids would do develop various skills, do various kind of small little assessments, and earn these patches for their sashes. But more and more, we're actually seeing badges represent achievements on the web. And some of these are just kind of fun or social, like Foursquare, for example, where you sort of check into various places and earn badges. But increasingly, these badges are representing real skills that are kind of based on real learning, real work, real tasks. And this is a screenshot of Stack Overflow, which is a technical forum, question and answer forum. And you'll see there's a number of badges here that represent both what, the traditional kind of harder skills like jQuery, CSS, but then also some kind of more social skills. And so it turns out that the sort of trend that we're seeing and the kind of potential out there are these badges that are reflecting, again, like real kind of sort of hard skills that you might see on a resume, but also a bunch of this other kind of social stuff. Some may call it softer skills, some call them 21st century skills, but a lot of this kind of other participation, contribution types of skills. And it turns out that employers are actually really looking for both. And actually, it turns out as well that they're willing to pay for it. And so this is a screenshot from Careers 2.0, which is a website that Stack Overflow recently launched, I think a year ago or so, where companies are actually paying for that data. So they're paying for essentially the sort of evidence behind these badge data to actually find high quality employees. So what if we take all of this that we're seeing, and we actually apply this to learning? There's lots of things that badges could do. We could think about badges sort of capturing and translating the learning across context. So that's capturing the learning path. So instead of just having an end grade at the end that's abstracted and that we lose sort of all of the details, we could actually badge things along the way. So at the end of the kind of learning experience or the sort of mastery point, you actually see all of the steps that someone took to get there, and that could help both them understand their learning, but then other people actually look at their badge collection and kind of figure out how to the various learning paths to take. Obviously, badges are for achievement signaling. You can actually show them to other people and sort of show the skills that you have. And then there's a set of things around kind of motivation and learning outcomes. So there's lots of kind of potential and also questioning around kind of badges as motivation, but certainly that's something that we think is possible and we should explore. Also supporting innovation and flexibility. So instead of just having a predefined set of skills or set of things to assess, like we see in sort of schools a lot, badges are sort of lightweight enough and also robust enough that they can help us really legitimize kind of newer skills or sort of newer approaches. And then finally, badges kind of really help us formalize and enhance the social aspect. So, there's a lot of in learning communities kind of identity and reputation, and this really helps kind of formalize that and communicate that across communities. And so thinking about that, then there's lots of different types of organizations that could use badges, and in fact, every single one of them listed here on this slide, we are already working with people that are starting to play around with badges. So open learning offerings like people like P2PU or MIT OpenCourseWare, after school programs, government agencies, museums, and even formal institutions. And Philip is representing Quinnipiac University, and most of the ones listed on here are more of the informal learning types of institutions. And I think the narrative there works pretty well, given that that there's real legitimate learning that's going on and it's not currently recognized, and so badges can sort of fill that gap. But then there are former institutions that are working to both either accept badges as credit or actually sort of have badges alongside formal transcripts or in some cases maybe even thinking about replacing some of that. So then the big question that Mozilla is really working on, and I think everybody, certainly in the DML competition and kind of this network, is really thinking about is, what if we were to think about this as an ecosystem instead of just siloed badge systems? And so that's really what the role that Mozilla is playing right now. We're building what's called the Open Badge Infrastructure, which is kind of the technical plumbing to really support us thinking about this from an ecosystem perspective, not just an individual or set of badge system perspective. This is just a quick thing to scare everyone away. No, just kidding. A technical diagram of the Open Badge Infrastructure, which I will break down a little bit. But the idea is that there's lots of different learning providers or learning experiences out there. Those can all be badge issuers. There can be badges aligned with all of those learning experiences. And an individual learner can actually have learning experiences across various issuers, earn badges across all of them. And so if we weren't thinking about this in an ecosystem way, those would all be isolated experiences. Those badges would all be kind of stuck within each one of those learning provider sites and would be kind of still standalone types of things. But because we are thinking about this as an ecosystem, that's where the Mozilla Open Badge Infrastructure comes in. So again, the learner earns badges across issuers, pulls them into a single collection that they manage called the Badge Backpack, and then they can share out those badges across various sites like personal websites, social networking, even job sites. And so the idea then is that those badges, those learning experiences that now have the badges tied to them, can actually lead to kind of real results like jobs, new learning opportunities, credits, etc. So the idea is that we're really kind of creating this life cycle or value chain for the badges. So from the learning experiences to things like employers, and really the learner is at the middle all the time. So again, what Mozilla is building is this plumbing in the middle. And if we look at sort of how this is working, if we take an example of a badge, and this is actually not a NASA badge, although NASA is developing badges, but so that they would be an issuer, right? So the issuers in this ecosystem are actually independent of what Mozilla is building. So that means that all the innovation can still happen on the issuer side. Issuers can decide what badges they want to issue, certainly what learning and skills they want to teach, what the criteria is, what the assessments are. All of that is completely still open for the issuers. The point of sort of standardization is sort of after the badge has been earned, sort of where do they push it into the open badge infrastructure, and what are the kind of criteria behind the badge. And so the point where we have standardized the badges is basically what information is included in the badge. So we've defined a basic metadata spec, which includes things like the title, the criteria, issuer, issue date. And so all of this is actually embedded with the badge. And so that information is carried with it across the ecosystem. So this becomes really powerful because, again, a badge is no longer just an image, but it's actually a set of information. It's a set of evidence that really tells you about the learning experience and actually lives with that badge wherever it grows across the ecosystem. So again, NASA issues the badge to a learner, and the learner can push that into their badge backpack. That badge is then stored alongside badges that they've earned from other experiences, and they can create groups, based on, they might want their skill badges for one audience and social badges for another audience. They can actually themselves see all of the information behind each badge. Again, this is all the metadata pulled out from behind the badge. And then they can share those badges out. So they can do those various ways. They can actually use embed code or share out publish the groups that they've made, or they can go directly through some of the display partners and actually pull badges into various display sites. So here's examples of badges on a job site, community of practice, personal blog, and social network. So again, the power here is really about being able to create this end-to-end value chain with the badges. So if we go back to thinking about scouting, this sort of metaphor works in some ways in that, again, these are representative skills, but what we're talking about here is definitely a step further because the badges are digital, it gives us the opportunity to really embed that the evidence and the sort of value within the badge itself, so that it's carried with it everywhere you go. And also, again, above and beyond the sort of traditional scouting model is that, again, we're all working together in this kind of ecosystem to create this end-to-end value chain to really put the learner at the middle and get real results at the end. So that is the end of my spiel. You can find out more on openbadges.org, and for all of you that haven't checked it out, you can actually earn your first badge there and create your backpack. So I encourage you to do that. But in the meantime, I will pause and we can open it up to start the discussion.
All right. Who wants to jump in here with a question or a comment on what Erin has had to say?
Hi, it's Doug. It might be worth looking at some of the comments from the chat on the live stream, Howard.
I will do that while our respondents have a chance to talk here.
Yeah, I have a quick question for you, Erin. In terms of the identity of the person holding their backpack, how will that be validated, or will it? And I suppose someone could have multiple sort of badge personalities. Like, let's say they were sort of a jack of all trades, and so they decided to have a series of badges for one field and another one for another, which they can represent, I guess, together or separately when they present themselves to the world. How does that work in the open architecture, open ecosystem of this?
Yep. So there's sort of several layers of this. The first is the sort of basic mechanism for sort of authentication and identity, and we're leveraging some work that Mozilla as a whole has been really driving around kind of defining an open identity standard. And so their current sort of product is called Persona, and it's an open identity solution that is built off an email address. And so currently the Open Badge infrastructure leverages that. And so all of your badges are tied to a particular email address that represents you kind of throughout the ecosystem. And Persona does have some tools where you can sort of, associate several email addresses together or something so that you can, kind of forge that identity. But then layered on top of that, then badges do become they become the sort of system for you to help build your identity online, or build a more complete identity and sort of tell a complete story about yourself. And so you may earn badges across lots of different things, like kind of more social badges, more skill badges, and then once those are in your backpack, you can create different groups that then you decide how you share those groups. So you might have badges that represent you as a programmer, or badges that represent you as a teacher, and you can kind of decide based on the sets of badges that you share, kind of what story you're telling about yourself with what audience.
And I
Erin,
suppose you can always change the email address that you're associated with it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Erin, quick question from the live stream. How do you become a badge issuer, and is there a quality control for issuers? And somewhat related to that question was how do you enable a very broad spectrum of issuers without it getting spammy?
Right. So so the way that you become a badge issuer is essentially making sure that your badges kind of conform to that metadata spec that I showed before. So basically building your badges around the defined metadata spec, and then you essentially you can use our issuer API, which there's documentation on openbadges.org. Use our issuer API to essentially call the OBI, if you will, and allow badges to be pushed to us. So you essentially, what you're doing, end up doing is posting what's called a badge assertion, which is essentially posting and hosting that blob of data. And then that gets pushed to the OBI, and then will live within that user's or learner's backpack. And so so there's really nothing. There's no like registration or anything. It's really about kind of conforming to that specification, and then leveraging our APIs. In terms of quality control, at this point there isn't quality control. I mean, we intentionally want this to be an open ecosystem, and so there's lots of examples of things that are actually pretty valuable to people from a recognition or a credential standpoint that we wouldn't expect. And that Careers 2.0 is a perfect example that I showed before. In Stack Overflow, there's a bunch of badges that seem pretty lightweight and seem pretty specific to that community. Some of those badges are things like, first responder, or, great editor, which seem pretty tied to the question and answer community and behavior. But turns out employers really value that, because it really tells them about kind of the 21st century types of skills like collaboration and teamwork, things that they really have a hard time getting evidence of right now. And so actually that, if we were to make some kind of constraints around what types of badges we thought should be in the system, we might have cut off those badges, right? But it turns out those are valuable. So for right now, it is open. Anybody that wants to push a badge in can push it in. I should say, though, that the issuer is not pushing a badge directly. An issuer is issuing the badge to the learner, and the learner decides if they want to push that to their backpack. So the learner, again, is the one in the center. So that's kind of the learner themselves is their sort of own spam filter right now. They can decide what badges they want to store in their backpack, and then even once they're in the backpack, they can decide what badges they want to share out with people. So they might have a bunch of badges in their backpack that are sort of like smaller, if you will, or fun or social badges that they just want to have because they earned them, because they care about that stuff, but they might not decide to share those with kind of, employers or whatever. And so that's the way it's working right now. And obviously this is all an experiment and something that we're all sort of building together. And so we're tracking that really closely to see if there's other things that we need to put in place as, adoption really takes off.
Um, I Phil Simon here from Quinnipiac. I think an opportunity. I mean, what I'm battling with, not battling, what I'm thinking about is the contrast between the traditional accreditation that universities get for academic programs so people can get degrees, and how this all, when you have an open badge system, how that fits into that. But I see an opportunity if an institution that's accredited puts badges out there for people to get, which they can get, it sort of becomes, well, okay, let's say it's a Quinnipiac badge. They get sort of the sort of, it's like I'm taking an open course that universities put out there. You can see the open course. You might show a certificate that you've actually understand the material, which is a badge, you do that, but you actually don't get credit for it because you're not matriculated into the program. So there's sort of a conflict there. But on the other hand, it might be a way for a program to attract students who see these badges and that they're validated. Like, it'd be different if Quinnipiac University or a Yale or Harvard, for that matter, issued a badge, is going to have a different kind of value as opposed to an individual who issues a badge on the same topic.
Yes.
So who issues the badge is going to become important in terms of whether it's considered of some value.
Absolutely, and that's intentional. I mean, that is why the issuer is part of that metadata. Is that is part of the sort of understanding evaluation of the badge itself. That said, right now the only people out there that can issue kind of recognition or whatever are the formal institutions, and so this is democratizing it a little bit in that there can be badges for other things, and even though it might not be a Harvard behind it, there's going to be evidence there, and if you kind of click through and look at that criterion evidence, they might, it's very likely that those are going to be quite compelling badges as well.
Hi, Erin. So first of all, I want to say the presentation was very, very impressive, and badges seem like such a turnkey solution for a lot of the problems right now. I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the pushbacks and some of the downsides, and some of the counterarguments you have to address them. Particularly, I'm thinking of right now the difference between badges in post-secondary education and in K through 12 education. It seems like in K through 12 education, there's a little bit more pushback because of the ideas of extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation for kids, and things like that. And I wonder if you could talk about some of the downsides and how you plan to address that or have addressed that.
Sure. So I should start that response with two things. One is that again, this is in a sort of early stages of an experiment, and so I think there's lots of questions that come up that we don't necessarily have answers to. There are certainly kind of things that I'll talk about now, but it's not that we've necessarily always addressed everything, but it's that some things are sort of kind of flagged for things we want to watch closely as we have adoption. Some things are sort of things that we all kind of agree with. Okay, we're gonna just agree on this assumption for now and kind of move forward. The second thing is as I'm answering this question, I encourage other people on the panel to jump in as well, because I know that Dan Hickey has done a lot of work on thinking about the motivation piece. But so on the K-12 higher ed, so one thing is that so first of all, there's the question around badges for formal education in and of itself is probably one of those issues that needs a lot of work to figure out how that's gonna play, because when you talk about badges for informal learning, again, like for the after school programs to open education, the narrative works pretty well, right? Like again, those are legitimate learning experiences that currently have no recognition, and so badges are filling that gap, and they're evidence based, and so it's getting us a lot further. Again, there's still things that we need to test out there, but it's getting us a lot further. But when you talk about badges for formal institution, that's exactly when all the questions around accreditation and all of that come back. And right now, the thinking about badges, my personal opinion is that it doesn't necessarily work to just overlay the existing system onto badges or overlay badges onto the existing system, right? Like, so there's a lot of kind of more thinking and work that needs to go into how that translates into formal institutions. And it's probably going to be on an institution by institution basis for a while. Like, we've already talking to some people, school districts, institutions that are willing to accept some badges from like local after school programs or whatever for credit. And so I think it's going to be kind of on that level to begin with, and then and sort of working through some of those issues that in the meantime. And so one thing that's come up from some of our work with formal education institutions is they would love an extra field, and this is getting a little technical, but an extra field in the metadata to point towards a competency framework, for example, so that you could say this is the competency framework that our assessments and criteria are built off of. And so that Mozilla or the sort of ecosystem at the ecosystem level will never define what you have to use, but we could add a field for you to be able to point to various things that you've decided to use, that kind of thing. So those are the types of evolutions that could happen as we start to explore these relationships a little bit more. I haven't necessarily seen more pushback from K-12 than higher ed on the motivation thing. Generally, I think the first thing that people think about with badges, or the first kind of issue that seems to come to mind, is the motivation issue, because people worry about the whole intrinsic versus extrinsic dichotomy and sort of crowding out. If the classic example of if a kid's getting good grades and then their grandparent starts paying them for the good grades, and then the grandparent takes the money away, and all of a sudden the kid doesn't get good grades anymore, right? Like, it was intrinsic motivation to begin with, then they added this extrinsic motivator, and that crowded out the intrinsic motivations. And again, Dan can jump in here, but I mean, I personally, based on kind of all of the reading that I've done and even experience that I've had, think that the dichotomy, or the sort of binary view of intrinsic, extrinsic, is actually too restrictive, or it's too simplistic for learning. And badges, actually, the way that we're thinking about it, if you remember that slide, motivation was one piece. There's a bunch of other stuff around, like empowerment and recognition, and that badges can provide, and I think that that makes that issue not as kind of, like, again, clear or good versus evil as it may seem. I don't know, Dan, do you want to jump in on the motivation?
I'll chime in. I'm really excited about this, especially the motivational aspects, because there's been a kind of a small international community that's been studying, sort of, I'll show this book that is sort of, that book goes back to 2000, and it's called Motivation in Learning Context. And it's a little weird, because this community has been plugging away for a decade now, kind of in obscurity, and it's interesting to us, it's interesting to me in particular, that this strong push for much more sociocultural and situated models of motivation hasn't really entered into the discussion. But most of us are arguing that the tension between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation is rooted in a very outdated learning paradigm that focuses on individual learners. And so what we're all looking forward to is badges, especially the inherent assumption around learning and badges, is this emphasis on social learning. I think is particularly articulated by Celie Brown. So there's folks like Andreas Lund in Norway. There's quite a few people in Norway who are looking at this intersection of motivation and assessment from a very social learning perspective. So that's the big argument here, is that the whole notion of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. People like Alan Collins have been saying, really, for 2 decades, that the negative consequences of incentives and rewards really says more about the sort of impoverished learning environments that don't give kids opportunities to improve or meaningful feedback than it says about anything inherent about the rewards themselves. So I'll just finish with the one main argument in all of my research and badges within the Quest Atlantis game that I've been studying for quite some time, is that you have to start by not looking at what's happening to the individuals, but start by looking at what's happening to the discourse that emerges around the badges among the participants. That's the most important thing, and you want to look past what you assume is sort of happening in the heads and hearts of individuals, because if you do, you'll get stuck in this sort of endless loop that's really rooted in 2 competing paradigms that themselves are a pretty outdated paradigm of learning.
Great, thanks. And I think one thing I would add on that too is often, actually, when you're then talking about the informal side of things, this motivation things comes up as well, and it's a little bit of a different kind of spin on it. But it's like, okay, so in the informal learning space, the interest-driven learning space, you know, it could be argued that a lot of this learning is already intrinsic, right? Because people aren't getting anything for it. And what happens if we do add badges and badges are a success, and all of a sudden, you know, are we sort of screwing up the balance there on the informal side? And I think there's some, again, this is something to really track closely, but I think there's some big assumptions in here that that we need to all kind of like think hard about. And I think some of those assumptions are, one, that that all kids have access to those informal learning experiences, which I don't think are true. Two, that the kids that do have access to that informal learning experiences actually understand that that's legitimate learning for them. I know lots of examples of kids that actually are, you know, not doing very well in school, but are doing like incredible things in these after school programs, but actually still think that they're bad students, right? Like they don't know, they haven't made that connection. Nobody's making that connection for them, or even if they are, like, it's not translating back to the schools. And so I think that that badges, there is the kind of motivational aspect, but there's so much more about the badges, about like helping people find learning experiences, again, helping them understand their reputation and their identity within these communities, helping them understand that these are real skills. Maybe they carry those back to the school with them and show their teachers to kind of, get sort of help the teacher challenge them more. Or maybe it's just the collection that they then can share with, like, for internships or that kind of thing. So I think, again, it's just too simplistic to just say no to badges because of this kind of concern around intrinsic, extrinsic, that there's a lot more kind of meat there that's worth really exploring this.
I know that Doug wanted to jump in here, and also Carla. So, Doug?
Go.
Yeah, just a little bit for me. So I used to be a teacher before I started working at JISC. I used to teach in secondary schools. Used to be director of e-learning. And the thing which strikes me is, yeah, there's all stuff around motivation and that kind of thing, but we tend to always think in kind of this McLuhan-esque way through the existing structures that we've got. So instead of it being either or, sometimes it's just and we find new ways of doing things which we previously didn't conceptualize because we didn't have the tools to do so. So I'm learning quite a lot at the moment. I know some like basic HTML and stuff that I've picked up along through my life, but through School of Webcraft on P2PU, I'm learning more things than I probably would do if I didn't have that structure and I wasn't being rewarded through badges and didn't have the community. And then, although it's not open badges, there's a new service called Duolingo, which is all about language learning, and it has this kind of structure and map, and it rewards you through badges, and it's really motivating. So that it means that the third thing that I'm learning at the moment, which is playing the guitar, feels a bit, I don't know, it feels a bit less rewarding because I'm just doing that face-to-face, and I haven't got this kind of motivation around that. So I don't know how that separates out in terms of extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. I don't know if it's a good or a bad thing. All I know is I'm doing stuff that I wouldn't previously have done, and as a teacher, that really kind of excites me.
Can I jump in? I really loved, Carla pointed me to a paper by Donella Meadows on sustainability and change, and it really was a nice, it's linked up on her blog post, and I think you really hit on something that I learned from that paper. She talked about, the paper called Leverage Points. And I just loved the paper because it really talked about sort of what are the most useful leverage points for sort of for changing organizations. And what I think is so exciting is that badges provide just the right level of formality to sort of coalesce this sort of changing paradigm. So I think what you were describing right there is the prior paradigms of motivation and assessment and accountability that are based on individual models of learning simply can't capture what you're talking about. And so anyways, I really love Carla's paper, and I want to thank her for pointing that to me. I've been referencing a bunch since I saw it a week ago, and I would recommend other people. It's Donella Meadows. I'll find the URL and post it.
Thanks. Carla, did you want to jump in?
I did, thanks. I think I wanted to address, I think, a few questions that have kind of come around. One was getting back to the original question about accreditation and issuing badges based on matriculated students and whether or not it made sense to do that. And I just wanted to reference David Wiley from BYU, who happens to be issuing badges right now. He's a huge badge proponent and really interested in the ways that it can motivate learning. And he actually happens to issue badges for both matriculated and non-matriculated students. So he offers courses that people can be a member of BYU, and they can also, you know, I think he's involved in education, so I'd have to actually have to double check on what exactly he's issuing badges for, but it's an upper level class, and he's interested in the learning aspect, and he's not necessarily focused on whether or not people are in formal venues. So it's a really interesting hybrid that he's starting to introduce, and recognizing that people are motivated to learn. Whether or not they're actually at the formal institution doesn't mean that they don't necessarily have access to that learning. So it's a really fascinating balance that he's achieved there. And then getting back to, I think, some other questions or comments that were happening a little earlier about the idea of looking at the system and recognizing the McLuhan-esque reference that Doug made earlier, that when you're within the system, it's really hard to imagine what the system could be like outside of the system, which actually ties in directly to the Donella Meadows concept, which is all about system design. So instead of thinking about it from a kind of formal academic world, starting to look at it as a system that's functioning, and then recognizing her number one point is actually that you have to recognize that your paradigm about your system is a paradigm. And this is kind of very metaphysical concept, but really deeply informative when you start to think about the ways that you can start to make change within systems, recognizing that the way that you're perceiving things is really important. So we're approaching a lot of this in a very traditionally cultural way, that we're seeing it through kind of a strong cultural worldview, but there are lots of ways to start thinking about learning, and as Erin mentions, that we've been focused pretty heavily right now in academia, but badges are useful across a variety of venues, and that's just something that I want to keep stressing as we keep focusing kind of on the you know, primary and secondary and post-secondary, but in fact, it's the lifelong learning that we're aiming to capture here, and that people don't necessarily stop learning when the minute they walk out of a four-year institution. They actually continue to learn, and a lot of the places that people end up in their profession is very far removed from what it is they've formally learned or have been formally taught. So,
before I went to Quinnipiac, I worked at Yale University for, God, 2 decades and developed a lot of web-based training systems for employees. And I could see badges being a very valuable tool for training within different organizations where there's a requirement that you sort of learn certain things. But there's the assessment of whether people really have learned is really not good at all. I mean, people go through a web-based course, they take a quiz at the end, and somehow the institutions decide that they know what they need to do. Especially within hospitals, for instance, or would be very, very valuable as a way to have the community kind of reinforce the level of knowledge necessary to do certain practices. Whether it be something as simple as leaving a hospital room and using Purell every time you leave, or things that escalate up in terms of kinds of hygiene and so forth within that. So, as you know, in terms of outside of the academic world, I could see it being very valuable for training to establish, especially for national organizations that accredit a hospital, and let's say in the level of safety, for instance. And just one other quick comment. I think the badges will be very valuable in a closed system for a college. I'm through a devil's advocate here, as a way to maintain some level of integrity about the own outcomes that you want for your students, and to maintain the value. And so just as a learning tool, it's very powerful for incentive in the community of students within a class, encouraging each other and how they're doing. I'm sort of, but I also see the idea of an open badge that a university issues that anyone in the world could take or could put in their backpack if they satisfy, might also be interesting as a way to compare, to see who's taking and how they're doing, especially in terms of if there's a way, as you mentioned earlier, Erin, about level of proficiency within the badge and so forth. Might be a very, very fascinating thing to think about. So I'm going to talk to my faculty about whether we want to develop a few badges that my program issues to the world around some of the things we teach, to kind of see what happens. It might be really interesting and fun to do.
That's an awesome idea. That would be incredible. And one thing I wanted to say on the sort of professional development side, you know, you're talking about kind of hospitals and those kinds of things outside of formal education, but there's actually a lot of people doing some work around badges for teacher excellence, and to sort of help us kind of rethink or redefine the way that we think about teacher excellence. And obviously this is most pertains to kind of K-12, but you know, badges do give us an opportunity to badge kind of smaller things, right? Like, or again, like sort of more kind of skill level types of things instead of you know, these kind of big, like, what are your test scores? They also give us the opportunity to sort of make that transparent, and so that you could just kind of really turn our sort of thinking around teacher excellence kind of on its head by sort of thinking about how badges might play out in that world. So that there is a lot of work going on there. There was actually part of the DML competition that was focused on that, and I know some of even we've been working with some of the folks at Department of Ed that are also very interested in that as well. So I think there's a lot of opportunity both on not just the learner side, but also the teaching side as well.
Yeah, Erin, I wonder if anyone's aware or have been getting these contacts that there's a request for proposals that just went out maybe a week ago or so. So already we're seeing at the Office of Adult Education, they added something very hastily into their request that said specifically that they are letting a large contract to give badges for helping adult educators learn how to use open educational content. And they specifically reference the competition, and they're specifically looking for people to put together groups of experts who are familiar specifically with the DML competition. So it's definitely spreading beyond K-12 and out into the Office of Education already as we speak. It's really exciting.
If I can jump in for just a second, we actually have in conversation with the Open University, and open educational resources is actually a huge opportunity, I think, for open badges to move into an environment where it is kind of an interesting, to me, it's an interesting hybrid between formal and informal, in that it's almost always distributed in some way. And so I think there are opportunities for open educational resources as they start to get developed to be related to badges. And remember, we're talking about an ecosystem of badges here, so essentially, ultimately, you're going to see a kind of knitting together that happens. While there may be duplicate badges, ultimately, there kind of, I think, a society will develop, a society of badges will develop, right? And that will be, and then it will in turn play out into the way that people use badges and reference and value badges, and perhaps it'll start to address the concept of accreditation in its own way.
Carl, I absolutely agree. And over here, I've had some conversations, some really interesting ones, where people who currently award assessments are quite frustrated because they've got the situation where there's people who have enough credits to be able to trade them in to get qualifications, but they don't recognize this because they've taken lots of different adult ed courses or whatever it is. Whereas some kind of system which could connect that up and say, hey, do you want to trade in these credits for a badge or some type of accreditation that they weren't aware of is really valuable. So there's lots and lots of different possibilities that we're perhaps not aware of, and it's perhaps a solution to a problem that only a very specific person has, or it's going to solve lots of different problems, different contexts, create new problems, and also open new opportunities, I think.
One other thing, Erin showed you kind of the visual earlier of the issuers and the displayers and the learner at the center, but I think it's really important to remember that it actually is a full ecosystem, and that the person at the center is making all the decisions about what they earn and where it goes and how it gets displayed is the earner of the badge. So the question about motivation in a lot of ways is actually already solved, because the earner is the person who's making those decisions initially. When it starts to move into that formal world where it's a requirement, I guess my own request would be to not necessarily duplicate the system that exists currently, but instead try to imagine the possibilities that Open Badges provides, and then use it to develop the things that you want to see repeated and suggested. The areas you want to see valued.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, we could, very easily tie badges to multiple choice exams, and again, like I was saying before, overlay badges on kind of the existing system. But it gives the fact that we are, all coming together around these issues, which is one of the most amazing things about the badge work so far. It really is an opportunity for us to kind of rethink things like assessment. as well, and really kind of embed those new kind of philosophies and thinking into the badges as well. And then that's certainly something that we're advocating from Mozilla. And I know, we've been working a lot with Dan Hickey around innovative ideas around assessment, and how to, sort of how to build that into the badge process as well.
Shall I take a question from the live stream? This is a question that I share as well. To do badges now with the system, do you have to understand APIs and programmer type things?
Yeah, so right now the Open Badge infrastructure is in what's called public beta. And so in order to plug into the OBI right now, yes, you do need somebody that can understand APIs and some level of programming, although it's not super, it's not a super deep developer type of stuff. And again, right now the OBI is, that diagram that I showed, it is the stuff in the middle and the actually issuing badges. So what badges you create, how you assess them, how you issue them, is something separate that right now you have to kind of build or manage. There are some platforms that have come through the competition that are in development. One is Badge Stack, one is Peer-to-Peer University has one that sort of will provide the platform to help you do that. And then Mozilla is also building a much more lightweight tool called Open Badger that will allow you to build a badge or build several badges, sort of set the criteria, and then actually issue them either directly from Open Badger or through your site. And Open Badger will sort of handle all of the technical components of that for you. So that's something that we're going to release midsummer. And so we also hope to see lots of that coming from the community as well once there's some examples there. So right now it is, other than in those few platforms that are out there, it is kind of on you to build the system behind it, but there's definitely stuff coming to streamline that experience as well.
Another quick question from the live stream. How do the description and criteria badge metadata relate to learning outcomes, which seems to be the lingua franca of learning descriptors in higher ed?
So the description of the badge in the metadata, there is a field for description, and that is simply just kind of describing what this badge represents, and that's kind of open to people to use how they want. There's also a required what's called the criteria URL, and that is supposed to be, it's a page that you host that is supposed to describe exactly what somebody would have to do to earn the badge. And so that's really the place where you should put all of the assessment information, basically, anything that you have that can sort of add to the kind of value and interpretation of the badge. And so the sort of learning objectives that you have could go there. The types of deliverables or learning outcomes that you would have had expected to see before someone earned the badge would go there. And again, the more that you put there, the more value kind of lives with the badge. And then there's also an optional evidence URL, which is meant to point back to a unique URL that would show the learner's actual work. So if I built something and wrote a blog post reflection, the idea is that evidence URL would then point back to that work that the deliverable that I made in my reflection. And then again, that would live with the badge. The evidence URL is optional because there are some kind of like privacy concerns, copyright concerns that some people brought up. For K-12, the institutions, they might not want to post a URL back to work where a student has put personal information, for example, or if they're using some copyrighted work for their own creation. And so that is, again, an optional thing. But again, if all of that is there, if there's a robust criteria URL and evidence URL, you can see how these really become this kind of strong evidence-based credentials or pointers recognition.
Okay, we've got 5 minutes left here, and I would invite respondents to jump in. If you've had something to say, now's a good time to do it.
I have a question I promised Erin I would ask. This is Dan Hickey at Indiana University. So I've been holding off getting started with badges in part because I want to really sort of dive in, but I want to turn my team loose and point them and say, okay, so I want them to sort of just pretend that they're actually just someone coming in out of the blue who's heard about this and wants to get started. They want to, like I said, we're doing a hack jam, and so we need to go in and set up some either some existing ones or some unique ones. So you suggested earlier going to the Open Badges site and getting a backpack, but what should we plan on? How much time? You know, what's the investment in taking someone who's wants to get in and get started in issuing badges for a specific activity?
So I don't think I think it's kind of a little bit of a kind of continuum. There are people that already have systems in place that sort of support badging, and so it's really the work there is, you know, doing some kind of thinking around the badge system itself, around what badges you want to have, kind of what the assessments are, and that kind of work. And so that's sort of, obviously that piece exists no matter what. But then depending on the systems you have, there might be additional systems work, like, you know, how are you going to handle this technically? And again, right now the options are there are a few platforms out there that you can leverage, and there's more tools coming, or again, you can build that in-house. And so that last piece can kind of, you know, can be quite small, or can be quite big depending on how you want to do it. But I think the actual badge system, like what we call badge system design, which is kind of what are the badges, what are the assessments, is also, you could quite quickly throw that together, or you could be quite rigorous about how you're thinking about it. So there isn't really a definitive answer. I mean, I think there's a lot of work going on to collect best practices around badge system design, and I know you're involved in some of that work as well. And so we're really hoping that, you know, over the next few months, there's a lot of resources that come out, both from Mozilla and MacArthur, but also from the community, certainly, even more from the community, that really help start to streamline that for people and help kind of show, like, here's examples of badge systems that have been built and that are, you know, quote unquote successful, however that's defined. And then at the same time, again, there will be more tools that come out that greatly reduce the amount of work needed from a technical perspective to then issue badges as well.
Okay, we've got time for a couple of more comments, questions. We've got 2 minutes left here. Anybody who has not jumped in a lot, this is your chance.
I have a real quick question, and I'll make it real quick. Is there a badge initiative for teaching the humanities?
So I think I actually don't know the answer to that question. I mean, I know we've talked to a lot of people outside of traditional STEM, if you will, that are looking to do this type of badges. And in fact, I think a lot of the some of the kind of informal learning space, like the museums that we're working with, you know, sort of tap into the humanities and are already doing lots of kind of informal learning in that space. I certainly think it aligns quite well with the humanities, and hope to see more kind of examples of folks doing it there as well. We do see a lot of this traditional STEM type of partners coming forward. And I mean that, you know, that is kind of like the hot topic right now, and so there's a lot of kind of organizations that have funding to really explore that, and so I think that's why we're seeing a lot of that now. But again, we are working a lot with a lot of museums and art kind of courses or after school programs that I think it aligns with well too.
Well, it looks like we are at the end of our hour here. Thank you, Erin, Carla, Dan, Doug, Michael, and Philip. It's been an enlightening session. There's been a pretty rich discussion in the text chat in the live stream as well. This is recorded and will be available in the archive at connectedlearning.tv. And next week, same time, next Tuesday, 9 a.m. Pacific time, we're going to have high school teacher Antero Garcia. I strongly urge you to come to that. He's a great experimenter, and he's on the front lines in teaching high school. So thank you all so much. Let's see. you can check out openbadges.org if you're interested in more information about badging. And thanks. See you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.